been almost a year since I decided to turbocharge this car. Now, this car was turbocharged a very DIY pieced together way, and it only cost me $1,047 to get the job done. Now, that includes a standalone ECU and a real name brand air fuel ratio gauge, so I have full control over this car's engine and full tunability. This is not a Band-Aid setup where you set up a car to run on a stock ECU that was never meant for boost. This is doing it what most people would consider the legitimate way to turbocharge a car right. Now, with that low cost came a lot of hands-on work from me, and it also meant that I made some mistakes because this was my first turbo build and I was learning throughout the whole thing. Now, I have a list of all those mistakes that I made, which we're going to go over in this video, so you don't make the same ones when you go to turbocharge your car. Now, none of the mistakes I made were catastrophic. Everything that I've had on the channel so far still stands. It's still the right way to turbocharge your car, but there's just a few little tweaks that I would have done differently to make this build go better, make tuning go better, and all in all just end up with a better turbocharged car. So with that said, let's get into what I didn't like about how I turbocharged this car. The first thing that has caused a major headache with tuning this car and getting it all set up is going with cheap eBay wastegate actuators. Now, this car has an internally wastegated turbo, so it has the lever arm that you mount onto the turbo. It's got the canister that opens up at a set amount of boost and opens your wastegate so you could control your boost. Now, I started out with an external wastegate kit from eBay that was supposed to be rated at 8 PSI, and I wanted to run less than that. So I rigged it up with some springs. I got it to run less than that, but it wasn't super reliable because it would open up pretty quick and then it wouldn't open up enough to hold the car at a certain level of boost. That was because the springs were only really doing something for the first couple of PSI, and after that they were fully extended and couldn't push that actuator open more. Now, that was a problem because I kept making more boost than I wanted to. So I went ahead back on eBay and I bought a 5 PSI wastegate actuator. Now, it was advertised as a 5 PSI wastegate actuator, but this thing actually wasn't opening until around 10 PSI. I was making, once again, way more boost than I wanted to start out, and I was just having a horrible time controlling the boost on this car. What I would highly recommend doing is getting a turbo and a wastegate actuator kit that comes together as one assembled unit. Mine was a turbo with a separate wastegate actuator kit, which isn't really doing the trick too well. For wastegate actuators and boost control, I would also go with name brand parts. This way you will know that the wastegate actuator will open at the amount of boost that you want to run. It'll make it so you're not over boosting. It'll make it so you could reliably run boost levels that are good for your budget setup. And all in all, you're just going to have a much better time if you go that way. Now, in the future, I'm going to go back to that 8 PSI wastegate actuator, and I'm going to have electronic boost control set up on this car to try to get the most out of it while still maintaining around 10 to 12 PSI of boost. Right now, due to the cheap actuator, I'm actually running 14 PSI of boost through this thing, and that's a little bit more than I want to run with this setup. Moving on to the second mistake that I made while turbocharging this car, we get to the location of the IAT sensor. Now, the IAT sensor is your inlet air temperature sensor that basically tells the engine and the brains of the engine, the ECU, what the temperature of the air going into your engine is. Now, cooler air has more oxygen in it per volume, and warmer air has less oxygen in it per volume. This sensor basically tells the engine how much fuel to put into your engine per amount of air coming in, and I put my sensor in a location where it's able to heat soak. Now, this means that the sensor itself gets really hot, and it tells the engine that the air coming in is hotter than it really is. Because of this, the ECU tells the engine to put in less fuel than the engine really needs, and it makes it really hard to tune. Now, this was most noticeable on this car when I sat at idle for a long time because the engine bay would heat up, that sensor would heat up. The car would think that it's sucking in really warm air when in reality it was much cooler than that, so it would inject less fuel and the car would start to go lean. Now, this made it really difficult to tune my idle, and it made it really difficult for the car to run well after it sat for a little while running. To fix that, you need to move the location of your sensor to somewhere where it's not going to heat soak, where it's in fresh open air, and what I'm going to do is move it down to the cold side of the intercooler. This is exposed to open air, so it'll get a much better, more realistic reading of air temperature and allow the car to run how it should. Number 3 on my list is the intercooler itself and the intercooler piping routing that I did with this car. Now, I tried to do something pretty unique that some people do, but most people do not, and that was route my intercooler piping over the radiator and down into a top feed intercooler. Now, most people run intercoolers with side feed, so the air goes in one side and out the other, and with mine it goes in through the top of one and out through the top of the other side. Now, I thought this was going to be good because it was going to be easier to route the piping, which it was fairly easy, but I did have to make some modifications to the front crash structure of my car, just opening it up a little bit to run pipes down to that intercooler. I had to cut up my hood, which took a while, and it was hard to really get it to fit right. Even now, the hood doesn't really want to close all the way perfectly all the time, and it was just a bit of a hassle. Also, what that meant is this intercooler in this car is a little bit smaller than I would have been able to run if I did a side feed intercooler. So if I were to do this again, I would go with a side feed front mount intercooler rather than a top feed front mount intercooler. Number 4 on the list, and this one is really big with Miatas, but it's something to consider no matter what you're turbocharging. The 1.6 liter Miatas have a weak drivetrain compared to the 1.8. That means that I've been running this car at about 150 wheel horsepower, which isn't that much, but it's enough to destroy the differentials on these 1.6 liter cars. Now, that hasn't happened to me yet, but I want to keep turning up the boost and making more power, and I essentially need to spend around $800 to get a new differential for this car, which I wouldn't have had to do if I started with the 1.8 liter. Now, I'm in pretty deep now, so I'm going to keep going with this car and get a 1.8 diff for it, but it's absolutely not the cost-effective way because now I need to spend almost as much as I spent on the full turbo setup on a differential. If you're turboing a car and they have different transmissions and different differentials that could handle more power than others, I would highly recommend starting with the more robust drivetrain so you don't have to spend money down the line. And those were the real big regrets and things that I would do different while turbocharging this car. The next few things are things that would have been nice, but they're not absolutely necessary, and these don't matter quite as much to me, and they shouldn't matter quite as much to you. Now, the first thing on the less important list, so the 5th thing overall, is tuning this car. Now, I tuned this car absolutely all by myself based on videos that I watched online and based on forum posts and based on the Speedy EFI troubleshooting and support page, which I'll get into more later. This took me a lot longer than paying someone to professionally tune my car. It also meant that I learned a lot more, but it took me a lot longer and it could have led to failure other than the fact that I was being super careful and I did tons of research ahead of time. If you want your car to just be turbocharged and run reliably, pay somebody to tune it for you. If you want to learn about it and really know what's going on with your car, learn what tune factors do what to how your car performs, tune it yourself, but always go a little bit at a time. Don't push the car right away, and don't do anything stupid as a beginner. If you're turbocharging a car, you really should install a standalone ECU before you turbocharge it and learn how to tune while you're naturally aspirated so there's less chance of blowing up your car. That will be a huge help to you so you have the knowledge going into your turbo setup and so you don't damage things that you otherwise wouldn't have if you took the time ahead of time to learn about standalone ECUs. The next thing is the turbo size for my car. Now, I used the smallest T3 T4 flange turbo for this car, but this Miata is only a 1.6 liter. This means that it doesn't spool up super fast, but it does make a decent amount of power on this engine once it does get spooled up. I personally would like a little bit faster spool and a little bit less top end power, which makes me sort of wish that I went with the T25 turbo versus the T3 for this car. The problem is super budget manifolds like this really only come in T3 for the cast version, so I was sort of stuck with the T3, which I'm fine with. Long term it's going to be fine and I'm still really happy with it, but I would like slightly faster spool. Now, you could look around for used turbos off of old Volvos and old Saabs, which are a T3 flange that are much smaller than what I have on my car. They're pretty hard to come by, but it's something that will allow you to run this cast manifold with a smaller, faster spooling turbo. And that's really all I have been unhappy with this build. Nothing major, like I said, but it's things to consider to make your builds easier and make your builds go a little bit smoother and better than what I did with mine. Now, I'm just gonna quickly go through the things that I am still super happy with this build, just so you know while you're going into yours. The first is I'm super happy with my standalone ECU, which is a speedy EFI plug-and-play unit for this car. Now, this is a super budget option. The ECUs themselves, I think, are around $275, and a complete plug-and-play kit with sensors is around $390, and that is an absolute bargain if you're turboing a Miata. If you're looking to turbo something else, they have a generic fish dog kit, which allows you to wire their ECUs into other cars they don't make plug-and-plays for, and I would highly recommend them. One thing I will say is that ECU did leave me stranded one time because I got unlucky. I bought an older unit, actually second-hand, and it had a little bit of a problem that left me stranded. Now, Speedy EFI as a company was fantastic. They sent me a brand new ECU free of charge, and I was back on the road within about a week after that problem. They've since revised the boards on their ECUs, so you shouldn't have to worry about that in the future. But anyway, I'm super happy with that setup on a budget. I'm also super happy with my AEM air fuel gauge. That's to be expected because that's a pretty top of the line part and it's performed very well. Back to budget stuff, the oil lines that I used for this car were straight off eBay. They have aluminum AN fittings, and those have also been doing the job very well. No problems so far, and I don't anticipate there being any. I touched on it a bit, but my cast eBay manifold has been doing great. My eBay turbo has been holding up great, and even though it spools a bit slower than I would like, it's really not that slow, and I could hit full boost by mid 3000s RPM starting from a low RPM, and that's still pretty good. This one is a bit controversial, but I'm also really happy with my eBay blow-off valve. Now, this is a knockoff HKS valve that a lot of people will tell you you don't need to run because if you're running low boost, you're not going to get any compressor surge when you let off the throttle. But I wanted to be safe with my car, even though it's an eBay turbo. Once I'm up at higher levels of boost, I don't want compressor surge off throttle, so I went with that sort of to be safe, but also because I really like the sound of the blow-off valve. Now, it's loud, it's obnoxious, but to me it sounds really good. And after watching tons of videos online, the knockoff HKS blow-off valves sound almost just like the real thing. And on a budget build like this, I'm pretty happy with it. Also, it hasn't started to leak or caused any big problems with this car, which is another thing that I'm happy with. If it does start to leak, I'll have an update video, but for now, I'm pretty good with it. So to wrap up this part of the video, before I get into future plans with this Miata, this car has been super fun, and for a very low price, I've turned this car into a fun car, to an extremely fun car that's actually sort of quick in a straight line. It's still not fast, but it's getting up into the quick range. Once we turn up the boost, do clutch, do a diff, get it professionally tuned, just to sort of compare that to what I did with my tune, it's gonna be pretty good. It should be around 200 wheel horsepower on a very reliable tune, which is what I'm looking for. It should be super fun like that, and that's something that I'm looking forward to. Again, if you're doing a DIY style turbo build, you really want to start off with low boost, not too crazy timing, and just tune your car safely and then ramp it up. Don't try to go crazy with your first turbo build and your first tune and blow the thing up in a second. Really ease into it. It'll save you money. It'll keep your build budget, because if you try to push it fast, you're going to be breaking tons of parts and you don't want to do that. And that's my advice for budget style DIY turbo builds. Now, getting into future plans for this car, like I said, I still need to do the clutch on this car. I have a Flying Miata Happy Meal clutch kit with a lightweight flywheel ready to go into this thing. I'm just waiting to find a differential. With that said, I'm still looking for a 4.1 or a 4.3 Torsen swap for this car. Now, they've gotten very expensive from what I could see, and they're all around $800, and all the ones up here in Connecticut are super crusty. Now, I want one that doesn't have tons of surface rust, doesn't have broken fins, doesn't have rust spots and holes in it, because I've seen that a lot with the support structure on these diffs, and that's not what I want. I really want something clean. So once I find that, I'll pick it up, throw that in the car, throw the clutch in this car, and then be pretty much good to go. Like I said, I'm also going to be moving that IAT sensor, and I'm going to be getting an electronic boost control solenoid so I could have that all ready to go with this car. It'll help with just a little bit faster spool and a little bit better control over boost in this car. And other than that, it's really going to be enjoying this car, little upgrades to the interior, possibly wheels and tires down the line. But I want to hear from you guys what you think of this car, what you want me to do on this car, and what you want to see on this channel. With that said, please like this video if you've enjoyed it. Please let me know down below if you've learned something or if you have any questions or comments for me about cheap DIY style turbo builds. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe for more, and I hope you stick around for the next one. Take care and stay tuned.